This is Brendan Long, and I'm today doing the third series of The Long View. It's a series of podcasts with important people, influential people, and we're talking about the economics of the COVID-19 crisis in particular. I am a senior research fellow at the Australian Centre of Christianity and Culture, which is a research institute of Charles Sturt University here in Canberra. So my guest today is Simon Banks. Simon is he is the managing director of Hawker Britton, one of the more influential strategic thinking groups in the country, and is a long-term former senior Labor staffer. So welcome, Simon, to the Long View podcast.
Glad to be here.
So what I thought we might do to sort of open our conversation today is to have a little bit of a reflection on where we're going to be on the 27th of September, which I think is the day where, under current plans, the JobKeeper scheme is going to end. And, in my mind is reporting from the ABS recently about how businesses are saying they are operating on very low cash flows, many with a month's cash reserves, some with only 3 months cash reserves. And that is in a JobKeeper world. So I'm interested in your views about what's the challenges for government as a whole when they have to come up against that decision as to whether they're going to stick with the current plan to get rid of JobKeeper on the 27th, extend it, or do whatever to it. So, what are the really big issues do you think that the government has to think about here?
Yeah, I actually think it's worth going back a little bit, Brendan, and just starting where we came from. I mean, obviously, the first thing that drives whatever government will ultimately have to decide is where we're at with the virus itself. And look, whilst the number of cases in Australia are still relatively low and hopefully manageable, I guess the recent outbreak in Victoria, but we've seen it before with that outbreak in northwest Tasmania, for example, you can't just assume you've got the health situation under control. You've got to continue onto that. And that can have really significant impacts on the economy. Just one obvious one that may come out recent outbreak in Victoria is it may delay the opening of some of the state borders across Australia, and obviously that has significant impacts not only for business but particularly obviously for the tourism sector, which is going to be doing it very tough over the period.
Oh yeah, I want to use my MCG membership this year, right? And if I don't get to use it for a whole year, then that's a problem.
Well, Mark McGowan over in Western Australia is offering to host the AFL Grand Final this year because at this stage, because they've been able to manage the borders over there and the spread of the virus within the Western Australian community so successfully. They're literally this weekend, effectively every second seat at their big stadiums will be allowed to be filled, which I think is a great and wonderful thing that they've got to that place. Then you've got to look at what are the kind of the policy instruments that we've got and what are they designed to do in this particular space. Well, there's obviously, two of them. There's JobKeeper itself, which you've mentioned. There's also the Job Seeker package, which is designed to, help people who can't be in work at the moment. The government's got two big decisions it's got to make around those. In relation to Job Seeker, I think you have to remember that government actually put that in place first. And I think if you go back and sequence it, I don't think the government actually really knew what it was doing when it put Job Seeker in place, because I don't think it had designed and planned to put JobKeeper in place at the time that it did. But it's going to have to make a decision about Job Seeker. I think whether we like it or not, I think it's pretty clear that they're going to reduce the amount of assistance that the Job Seeker package provides. I think the real issue is it going to be more than the old New Start allowance? I think it will be. It's just a question of how much more. So that sets an underpinning, if you like, for the debate, because obviously at the moment, if you can get $1,200 a fortnight under Job Seeker and $1,500 under JobKeeper, Clearly, you'd rather be on JobKeeper than JobSeeker, but there isn't a massive gulf between the two. If there are big cuts to JobSeeker, well, then that starts to drive one set of behaviour. Then
one
we come
interesting aspect of this is that people have forgotten about this, but in the famous Tony Abbott first budget, Joe Hockey's first budget, which was a shocker. One of the things they tried to deal with was this alignment of pensions and allowances, and over time the indexation rate for pensions had been much higher at AWOTI, whereas the average weekly total earnings, whereas obviously for Newstart it was at the lower CPI rate. So or a rate close to the CPI rather. So that was a massive problem. Now, I was thinking about this the other day. The government's got a unique opportunity to fix this now. Even if it does reduce JobSeeker to a lower level, and I think most people think that in the long term, $1,200 as a job search, as an unemployment benefit is a very generous benefit. But if it's going, when it considers wherever it goes to on this, I still think, they should use the motto, never waste a good crisis. Let's finally fix that anomaly,
Yeah.
Because I think one of the reasons, go on, yeah.
Yeah, both agree. I mean, obviously, like Newstart was too low, and obviously it had stayed under the current government. I think we have to be fair. The Labor Party person, the Labor Party hadn't fixed that when it was in government either, and I think it was something it should have done. Having said that, going into COVID, we had support right across the community. I mean, we had obviously, ACOS, the ACTU, and the Business Council, all arguing Newstart. It simply wasn't providing enough support, not only for people to get by on a day-to-day basis, but then actually to make themselves job ready. And that's actually what we need to do. I've been an advocate, for example, about having an independent panel, a bit like we do with sort of wage setting, if you like, to actually those types of allowances to make sure that they're actually set at a decent and reasonable level that make the public policy purposes, which is one obviously
basket of goods approach that Peter Saunders often talks about at the University of New South Wales, and the Blair government tried it actually too initially when it first started. No one's ever really been able to succeed in getting it, but in other words, a real measure of what is the cost of living and what is sort of a subsistence existence. Obviously, be different in Sydney than it would be in in some other parts of the country, but wherever they go to that, you're right. I mean, they could choose a new basis for measuring JobSeeker. I mean, the old days, it notionally used to be worked on as half median wages, and at least in terms of the age pension. Now that's sort of we're still going to probably end up moving away from that, aren't we? Really, in a new JobSeeker world, anyway. So they might need a new benchmark. Well, they can just invent one, but I mean, it'd be better to have, as you say, a basis for assessing what the level should be.
You would rather set on a rational basis and that it constantly be tested against the public policy purposes that it's there to do, which is to provide people, a reasonable standard of living and the capacity to go and get work if they can. I think that's what you want a payment of that nature to do. Anyway, that's sort of one component. Then you've got obviously what you're going to do with JobKeeper. And again, I think you need to go back to what the purpose of that is all about. Now, putting aside some of the design issues, which obviously in part were done because it just had to be done in such a hurry, and the government was focused on just having the payment a very simple form of payment and easy to acquire. And putting aside the fact that there were clearly some parts of the community, like casual workers, people in universities and others who it should have extended the payment to, at least in some form, and didn't do it. When you look at the purpose of JobKeeper, what its job was to try and identify those workers who had some reasonable prospect of maintaining their employment on the other side of COVID, making sure that those businesses could continue to keep them and the connection with their employer for as long as was reasonably possible. And then obviously, hopefully, they just get back to some form of normal work at the end of the day, and then the payment gradually disappears from underneath it. I think there are a couple of really basic things in terms of all of that. The first is, I think we just have to be really honest with ourselves that come September, there will be some workers who their jobs just no longer exist and there is no reasonable prospect of them existing. And I think what the government needs to look at is what are other job creation projects that we can engage in, try and shift those workers into real work. I don't think leaving people, for example, some of the JobKeeper people are basically in what are called zombie jobs. They'll never be returned, working 0 hours today and they're never coming back. That's not fair on those individuals to leave them in that for the long term, nor is it fair to the wider community to do that either. On the flip side, you've clearly got some businesses that are getting back to whatever the new normal is going to be, and we're getting an increasing idea of what that looks like as we gradually manage the virus. And obviously for those people, assistance should gradually fall away. I think there's kind of two middle categories in between. One is that there is about how quickly you withdraw the assistance of JobKeeper, where there is some prospect of sort of future employment, or ongoing employment. I think just driving it off a cliff is not a particularly smart move, particularly for those workers where there's still some uncertainty about their financial position. I think one of the features of JobSeeker, which was JobKeeper good, is it gave 6 months worth of certainty. So giving people some more certainty in those categories, I think would be really useful, even if that's a tapering of the benefit over time. So you don't get that kind of personal and collective fiscal cliff that people from the Reserve Bank, the business community and others are warning about.
Well, if you went straight off JobKeeper and perhaps JobSeeker at a similar time frame without an adjustment to the definitions of who is unemployed, I mean, you look at it and you'd have an enormous unemployment rate, And so what are we now estimating that the real unemployment rate is 14%? It could be higher. Could be higher, which is genuinely scary. But that's so. You can see. I don't know what people, what government research is picking up, but I wouldn't be surprised if people were genuinely fearful about that world. And it's not far away. September is not a long way. So I sort of agree with you. I think the idea of a cliff is more or less unthinkable economically, let alone politically. And that's the dilemma that the government faces. But on the other side, I mean, I've got my 21-year-old who is getting $1,500 a week JobKeeper and was really only earning about $150 a week before at the Canberra Labour Club, is probably going to is going to sort of mourn the passing of the scheme. But like I noticed that Jared Dwyer, who made a representation to the COVID committee this week, raised a number of really interesting anomalies with JobKeeper. And the question I think a little bit is whether the government has any scope to tweak it. For example, what Mr. Dwyer indicated, and he's the General Secretary of the Shop and Distributor Allies Employees Union, the retail union, that if there were a number of people who had a part-time job, but they didn't earn much money from it, but they earned a fair bit of money out of a casual job. But because of that small part-time job, they completely were ineligible for JobKeeper. And they were probably the ones that should have got it most, even and having been employed for, long-term casuals. So, I mean, is there scope, do you think, for government to tweak it as it phases it down? Or are we just going to have to live with these sort of anomalies?
Well, certainly I think that type of anomaly, I mean, the Labor Party's actually been arguing the government should fix that one and better to people, whether it's casuals or others. I mean, one of the perverse things the government's done by excluding so many of the casual workforce in this arrangement is it's created this massive premium in the job market around actually having some form of a permanent job.
Yeah.
I mean, if you had a job today and you had a choice between a casual job and a permanent job, you would clearly now choose a permanent job, not just because of other reasons. If you're kind of genuinely tossing up between the two, the reason why you'd do it is because you'd know if there was another COVID outbreak and you're a casual, you'd
Yeah.
get nothing. Whereas
Yeah.
if you're a permanent, you've got a chance of some protection or insurance. So perversely, a government that likes to pretend it likes flexibility in the workforce has just told the entire workforce that a permanent job is infinitely more valuable to you because of the insurance and protection that it provides. So, that's a really obvious and a strange, I think, philosophical way in which the government's gone about it. But if you then come back to I guess, what can the government do, which is that I think one of the first things it needs to do is provide, certainty for employers. And I think one of the mistakes it's made, for example, with its childcare package is changing that halfway through, is that there will be some of those employers that were reliant upon having the JobKeeper package for 6 months and now aren't going to get it. And that's their certainty and confidence. Of course, there might be other childcare providers that prefer the new arrangement, but they really should have given employers a choice, I think, if you were going to change those arrangements. I think the next thing is that it'll be clear for some sectors where they're on the path to mending, if you like, but some assistance is still needed. But you may not decide that JobKeeper is the best way to do that. There might be other forms of assistance you can provide to that sector, which are a more effective way of keeping people in employment and keeping that sector going. And again, that assistance could be stuff that tapers out over time. But there are going to be some sectors of the workforce, and I mentioned earlier the sort of the tourism sector, where we know that at some point we're going to bring back tourism both domestically and hopefully ultimately internationally. We know that we want to have a highly skilled and capable sector. Australia, let's face it, is going to be a highly desirable destination for people to come to. We already kind of went into COVID with a relatively sort of clean green image as far as the rest of the world's concerned. How that's been bolstered by this is a healthy place to come to as well. So there may be some of those sectors where, they're not going to get up and running for maybe another 6 months, 12 months even, where, perpetuating JobKeeper in some form might be an option. One interesting idea that's out there from the ANU at the moment is about having, for some of these types of workers, a kind of a HEC-style scheme where
the income contingent loans. I mean, they're so trendy. I mean, us economists want to make everything an income contingent loan. But, I'm not surprised he's gone for it. But you like that model?
Well, I think it's an interesting one to explore. The one concern I have at the moment with it is that whilst in theory I understand why it might be attractive, what you're saying with businesses, we know you're going to have some income down the track. We'll basically give you some credit now, and when the income comes, then you can pay the loan back and you'll be okay. I think one of the big problems in this uncertain environment, and we're seeing this already with a bunch of the programs, other sort of support programs the government's running, is most people just don't want to go into more debt because they don't know they're really taking on. So whilst I think in theory that may not be a bad model, I think you'd really have to sit down with any affected sector and say, are you really prepared to take this risk?
The problem with these things is, and I mean, I sort of like the model, to be honest, but we have this thing, this theory called adverse selection. And basically it means that, the government doesn't really know whether this firm who wants the extra money to survive is really bona fide a firm that is going to continue, or is it really effectively a zombie firm just, being propped up by JobKeeper? And those sort of informational uncertainties, informational asymmetries, just can't really be known. So there's a high degree of risk for government. But I think, as you know, I do share that sort of broad social justice Labor Party view. And, in this situation, the thing that I think must worry us most is not so much the perfect economic model, but the enormous personal cost that's happening to people's lives. Obviously, we've avoided the massive costs to health and life that many European countries in the US and Brazil are now facing. But, the devastation from the recession, which we've sort of created by policy, is, I think is going to last for many years. And so I think we should err on the side of the compassionate approach. So, I think if Warren McKibben offers that as a model. I think that's something that I think Australians would probably be open to, you know. And they're also used to it with the, you know, the university thing. I just want to divert a little bit into an ACT issue, because here we are in Canberra, both of us long-term Canberrans. And, you know, I, like yourself, have used to do a fair bit of air travel, usually at least once a week, and for many years, but no air travel now. So, you know, I do think there's an interesting case being made by Canberra Airport, which is obviously worried about keeping its staff as well, as a fairly big employer in the city. You know, whether we shouldn't be thinking harder about trying to have that travel bubble with New Zealand and get a weekly flight to Wellington from Canberra. You know, to me, given where we're both at, well, I think that's an interesting, you know, an interesting way of providing a bit of safe stimulus to the ACT economy. What's your view on that?
Well, personally, I think it would be great if it could happen. Like I say, I've got an office over in New Zealand, which I'd like to go and visit. Also, you know, there you go.
You can do some snowboarding.
So,
I can snowboard actually, but it'd be a long way to go for a snowboard. But anyway, go on.
You know, in principle, I think it would be lovely. I think the reality, though, is you look at the response from New Zealand to this, which is actually we're the ones taking the risk, not you.
Yeah.
So I think they're going to be far more cautious about agreeing to an arrangement like that. So unfortunately, because effectively we're in the sort of the New South Wales Victorian, you know, travel bubble within Australia. If New Zealand was to take a selective approach to jurisdictions that they opened up to, I think it's far more likely they'd go for, you know, Queensland or Western Australia or one of those places before, unfortunately, they came to the ACT. That said, I think we should always have the offer on the table in case they're prepared to offer it up to us. I think the far more interesting stuff where I think the ACT government's showing really great leadership is about trying to get some of the international students back into the market. You know, yes, they'll need to go through a period of quarantine before they're allowed out into the community. But you know, so much of the Canberra economy is built around that knowledge, skills, investment that so many international students have.
Yeah, and they can be quarantined at the university itself in many ways. You know, within that student accommodation block, which so yeah, I mean, it's and the idea of charter flights is good. I mean, that's one of the cases I think where government worked quickly with industry, in this case, universities, to you know, come up with a creative solution that really worked, or I think is going to work. Yeah, so, and that's good for the city. Yeah. Oh well. Okay, so no flight to Wellington for a while, little thing. We think. Okay.
Might be a little bit longer, but look, I still.
Well, I hope that at least they open the flights to the Gold Coast. So at some stage, but maybe that's just a reflection of where we are in this bitter Canberra winter. Simon, it's tremendous to speak to you and to get your insights, particularly your sense of where we are, where the issues that government faces, as it's got to try to consider where we take this incredibly difficult situation we find ourselves in as an economy, as a world, but particularly as an economy in Australia at the moment. So thanks for joining us and giving us your insights today to the long view.
Pleasure.